Hello, thank you for coming. I am Tim Rice. We are working in Chapter 7 in your text. Here's your text, Psychology, A Christian Perspective, High School Edition. It's available at the link below. Chapter 7 is entitled Learning and Memory. In these lectures, we are looking at one part of learning, and that's behaviorism. There's two ways we can look at behaviorism. One is the scientific study of behavior, the scientific study of learned behavior, the scientific investigation of the rules of behavior, the factors that influence behavior like rewards and other environmental factors. We can look at behaviorism as the science of predicting behavior and of changing behavior modification. But we can also look at behaviorism as a philosophy, as a major theory, a major school of thought, a philosophical perspective that has been major in psychology's history. Before we talk about behaviorism as a philosophy, I want to speak about it specifically in terms of learning. What we've done with each topic so far is we've looked at it at two levels. The common and the distinctly human being the two levels. When we spoke about sensation and perception, we recognized that sensation was the neurological experience of an external stimuli. It was common, but that the full subjective perception, conscious awareness of the world is not common. It's distinctly human, an entirely different level. Motivation, hunger, we eat. It's common, but we are motivated in distinctly human ways. All organisms react to impending death with fear and physiological and psychological reactions, but the full range and the full experience of emotion, human emotions, is distinctly human. And in terms of behavior, that's true also. We can look at the rules of behavior or factors that influence human behavior, like lab rats in a maze, but that a full and a satisfying understanding of human learning needs to consider distinctly human learning as well. Language, learning social behavior being two examples. So when we look at behaviorism, the philosophy, as a worldview position, we can then compare it and contrast it to a Christian worldview perspective. To understand behaviorism, the science and the philosophy, you have to go back almost to the beginning of modern psychology. We've talked before about experimental psychology being the defining difference between modern psychology and ancient historical psychology, natural philosophy. And in the history of psychology, behaviorism is the logical direction for the young scientific discipline to go. What is there that we can experiment on over and over in humans and animals? Behavior. Psychology couldn't develop as a serious science without having measurable and observable things to study. And internal mental states were too subjective and weren't measurable. But behaviors could be measured, observed directly, and we could count them. So it makes sense. And there was a flood of experiments and discoveries in psychology's history. And its founders were famous. B.F. Skinner and John Watson were like rock stars. They, I guess rap stars would be a better metaphor. B.F. Skinner was the kind of guy you'd want at your dinner party. He was on talk shows and hosted Discovery Channel-like programming about behaviorism, and there was it was big news, big science news, big news in the culture. It promised a better world. Behaviorism brought the promise of a better world through the proper application of behavioral principles. And it influenced education and industry and parenting and more, and it continues to do so today. But there are three general positions of behaviorism, of philosophical behaviorism. Here they are. And Skinner and Watson, they were radical behaviorists. They argued that their discoveries should be extended to everyday life, and they argued that people's lives would become fuller and more satisfying if they were controlled, presumably by a behaviorist, in a properly behavioristic way. So here are the three general positions of behaviorism. One is there is no innate knowledge. We're born a blank slate. All you need is learning. The strong view of behaviorism is that everything you know, everything you are, is the result of learning, the result of experience. There is no real human nature. Rather, we're just infinitely malleable, changeable. This view was really appealing in America. If there's no human nature, then there's no group or no royalty that's better than any other group. So Watson claimed he could create anybody in any way he wanted simply by treating them in a certain fashion. He said this, quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train them to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." Number two, you can explain human psychology without mention of mental notions like goals and desires and emotions. Anti-mentalism, a rejection of internal mental states like attitudes and as a rejection as suitable for scientific experiment, but also a position that they didn't really exist, that they weren't real, that they were illusory. Finally, behaviorism believed that there was no interesting difference across species. These behavioral mechanisms apply to all species. So Skinner would admit that a human can do things that a rat or a pigeon couldn't. But he would say that humans and rats really aren't different at all. It's just that humans tend to live in a richer environment than rats. Humans have a more complicated array of responses. Skinner's behaviorism, the philosophy, undercuts the uniqueness of human psychology. The maze, the rat in a maze represents all environments, and the rat all forms of life, from protozoa to humans. But now, free will is a bedrock of a Christian worldview. The story of Adam and Eve in the garden is about free will. Skinner said there is no such thing. We do not have even a limited ability to transcend environmental influences. We operate as a closed cause and effect system. It's reductionist. Reductionist meaning that we're not a whole, a gestalt. We're reducible to individual behaviors, and those behaviors are explainable by identifiable environmental causes. These principles of behaviorism, philosophical behaviorism, are clearly inconsistent with a Christian worldview. And there's not many radical behaviorists anywhere anymore. Behaviorism is not the best naturalistic philosophy there is anymore. Where once behaviorism had the scientific consensus that it was sufficient to explain human learning and human nature, it is not today. But the naturalism persists today in evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology adds a layer on top of behaviorism to explain all human behavior, to explain human nature. It loops around. Let me try to explain. Researchers were able to allow monkeys to directly stimulate the pleasure center of their brain. An electrode connected to a device, and the monkey is able to directly experience pleasure, and the monkeys will experience pleasure to the exclusion of most all else, in some cases to death, right? So the reward doesn't have to be real in the world. It's the activation of the brain in the monkey that is the motivator. And we experience pleasure in the brain. And so evolutionary naturalism describes that pleasure center as an evolved mechanism that reinforces behavior. So genes are able to provide us pleasure to reinforce behaviors that have a reproductive and a survival function, that serve to perpetuate the genes. So, in conclusion, in terms of science, there's so much that we're going to talk about in the next lecture that psychologists have discovered and described, and much of it leading up to and building on B.F. Skinner and his discoveries. So we'll get to that next. The science of the study of behavior. Thanks for coming. Bye.